what I just wanted to say was Laura's comment on explaining and describing. It's kind of new to me in a sense that I've not really thought about it that way. And when I read here about the hotel locks, he speaks about in Moscow, about the place, hotel locks as a place situated in a space, and hotel locks as a place encompassing different spaces, rooms, apartments, and all that. It's quite this sublime move between space and place, so to speak. That just highlights that argument. But then in explaining, in terms of explanation, I try to see, because he writes at a point where a vacant room at certain times might highlight that someone has been dedicated for probably to be killed or something else during the wartime and all that. And trying to explain the space from that account, in the sense that what can a vacant room tell? What could a vacant room in hotel locks tell, or start an explanatory rhythm about communist Russia in the period of the war? I think it's a whole new perspective to explanation anyway. In the way I see it, I think it's more like what I'm doing with causal layered analysis. It's more like deepening the argument. If I take a vacant room as a unit of analysis and try to deepen what a vacant room in hotel locks means at that time, and try to go deeper into how it relates to probably the social causational causes or the factors of events going on at that time, and then bring in, like arguments I speak on from the worldview. In a way, I see it probably as a different paradigm of historical writing, but I don't think that explanatory perspective might be lost so much, because in a way, it's kind of like opening new spaces for understanding the communist struggle. In my own thinking, like yesterday when we were with Lars, he said he met his supervisor or something at some point, who was very open-minded in history. Then he described to him about his work on Ethiopia and what he was going to do. I think he was working with the last Zulu rebellion or something. And the professor was like, "Oh wow, I've also always been interested in the rail line between Jos and Lagos." And I was thinking in my mind how much the rail line from Jos to Lagos tells a lot about a certain period, but it's still a space. In a way, it goes beyond probably describing that space, but I think it extends the explanation towards other networks and agency and all that, just the rail line in that sense. So I just think this perspective to space is quite challenging in a way that, while it can also dwell on a descriptory discourse, that by deepening the investigation of certain spaces, we might be able to connect, like networks, agencies, and all that, and then build up a new kind of explanatory paradigm in that sense. Yeah, so tricky anyway.
Laura.
Schlögel is saying you have to look, but he says, but you also have to know things. So you have to come with some preliminary knowledge before you start looking. And often our preliminary knowledge comes from, well, history books or depending on who we are. So, for instance, in the case of the causes of the First World War, we have a certain knowledge which may have to do with something that happened in one particular place. And sometimes there is a risk that our previous knowledge combined with the focus on one place strengthens traditional dominant narrative because it brings everything into one place when in fact there is a long economic social development leading up to something, such as the First World War. So I think it's important to be aware of that and instead try and use a spatial analysis when we learn something new, when it brings out something we did not understand before. And I love the idea of Sarajevo as a multicultural space or a multicultural moment, because those moments happen in spaces. But this kind of Händelsehistoria in a space, I think has its risks.
But which story do you want to choose?
Sorry?
The story of the Duke or the story of Gavrilo Princip?
I don't know if I want to. I don't want. My point was I don't want to choose neither of them. I want to choose another story where probably the places are much more scattered around the world, leading up to the First World War. There are so many stories. I choose another place.
But still, you will be forced to go at one point to Sarajevo. But yes.
Okay, reading these texts and listening to this discussion, I come to wonder whether it's also, or in a sense, a matter of verstehen, hermeneutical understanding, creating a deeper feel or sense for the place connected to situations, events, people participating in these events and situations, and thereby gaining something for your explanations. I'm wondering about this Verstehen dimension, and since he's a German, I suppose that Verstehen is somewhere out there in his mind also, because I've sensed this many times. And Peter England, one of Sweden's, he says, as he has said sometime way back, that as an historian you can see things when you visit a place. And I can many times, often when I go abroad, I go to historical sites, and I can have this sort of second-like sense of seeing people there, doing their things, ordinary things, dramatic things, etc., etc. And that to me is like a Verstehen dimension. But then it has to be transformed into, of course, a narrative and explanation, etc., etc. That's something that lies ahead from this Verstehen. So I'm wondering a bit, when listening to this, if it's not also a matter of Verstehen to a large extent.
I'm also thinking about John Scott, who always said that if you want to know why, you have to ask how. Like, how is the first, and the why comes. If you can explain how things happen, the description is important.
I will maybe contest a little bit the Holger's discussion about the Archduke and Gavrilo Princip, saying that I would argue that it's not the same. It's not the same place.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That you were saying there are different stories, but it's the same place. But I would say that they are two places. And but well, I don't really want to go into the discussion of space and place, because there are, of course, those that, or actually that's the discussion that we should do. But it's still that's not what I want to discuss. But I was really inspired by Peter's discussion about the square, where I also have been looking at a particular square in Anumabu on the Gold Coast, or in a Gold Coast setting, but it's today in Ghana. I visited a square there where, for me, it says reading a source, because there aren't really a source that I can read about this square telling me about how people would have understood this space. The square is a place, but the colonial environment is a space that those who are colonized read it differently than the colonizers read it. So I've been imagining different people, I mean colonizers and colonized, coming to this square, and what are they reading in this? What are they seeing? The colonizers are seeing their fort. They are probably seeing the church that is also at the square, and then they are seeing these merchant houses that are built in stone that look like European houses. They are built by Africans, or these Euro-Africans merchants, wealthy. So you could say, oh, this is a quite nice British empirical manifestation on the Gold Coast, where it points to civilization and in an English manner. But then the colonized, which I can't ask them, but what I can describe is that they also see the same buildings, but these African buildings, even if they're built with masonry, that is a technique that they've taken from Europeans, they aren't built as European buildings. The structure inside is an African structure. The rooms are built with an African layout, African idea. The extensions to the buildings are built as the extensions to African traditional buildings would have been. And also, they are higher than the fort. They are only there's small narrow passage between the fort and one of these bigger, it's a brew house, which is a fort in itself. This African contested this European dominance in this space. But is this the story, the narrative that a European would have told himself or told anyone visiting this place? I don't know, probably not. I think that they probably would have wanted to see this as a manifestation of civilization or religion and the Western influence in this space. But I would call it a hybridized space. There are hybrid forces on the move here, and different meanings.
It's even more complicated because, again, you have two narratives. Because those who come from an African diaspora would like to have one narrative of suffering. But those who were living in these houses were slave traders who sold the forefathers of those who come back and try to remember. And this is very visible in the so-called slave forts. We now have put placards on the main door leading to the sea, says that the gate of no return. And now this is even, because there was this big festival of the return, so now it's on the other side. When you come from the sea in to the fort, you have the gate of return, which is the symbolical return of those sold in slavery. But the problem is that it's not the same history of those people who are still living in that site in Cape Coast and Amal, because they were dealing and trading with the slaves, their forefathers. Because it depends on which kind of story, which narrative.
But my argument here was that we as historians, we make narratives, connections and descriptions through written sources, but this is also what we can do with space without written sources. But the historian is also always, in a way, his main component in also writing these explanations, and it might become quite deterministic in a way that Laura was saying, that sometimes we reinforce a history, a narrative, when we also visit spaces and we see this as enforces our picture of something. So there might be like challenges of deterministic explanations.
But of course, places are challenged. In the best example, of course, when you put on plaques on houses or put on a monument. And I come back to Sarajevo because I had one of your colleagues, one of my MA students, writing his MA thesis about the two sides, because it's a contested place. For whom do you put up a monument? If Austria would have won the war, there would have been one big cathedral on that place commemorating, most probably that nowadays the Duke would be a saint, because that happened in St. Petersburg, on the place where Tsar Alexander II was killed by the anarchists. You built a cathedral on that very place where the precious blood of the Tsar was on the ground. That didn't happen in Sarajevo because Austria lost the war. They managed to put up a stool, a kind of a stele, commemorating the death of the Duke. But of course nothing was said about Princip. But when Yugoslavia then came into being, they put up a plaque commemorating Princip, of course, and removed the memory of the Duke. Then when Croatia, fascist Croatia, came into existence in 1941, the memory of Princip was removed, and again the Archduke was remembered. And then when Tito won the war, they kind of tried to balance the whole thing, but still it was Princip. But then after the disintegration of Yugoslavia, nowadays there's a museum in the corner house where they kind of try to balance the story, and the monument for Princip is now lifted on the wall of that house. So it's not actually the site where Princip was standing, but it's put up on the wall. It's a really kind of nice story about the contested place. But again, it was a question about two narratives that are kind of competing with each other. And depending on the political situation, the one is the kind of hegemonic one, and the other one is the counter-narrative. But it changes.
I don't know if Hanna was before me.
Can I just say, on the
Yeah.
note of Princip,
Yeah.
my granddad was a prison guard guarding Princip in...
You see?
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've sort of... This is reflecting back to what you started off with, Laura, about agency in history, and you talked about capitalism and the need to give it a body and a place. And I'm just reflecting on my students. I have had responses to, for example, when we do the Great Divergence and look at environmental history as a way of thinking about why Europe and the West became rich and the rest not. They despair. They sort of, there's no agency here. We're just sort of victims of things we can't do anything about. So they find it quite, they don't like it because of that. We talk about, I think it's a good way of talking about history. But, so agency, I think, is key. I'm wary about where too much emphasis on space might sort of lead us away from agency. And this is a slightly long story, but I'm thinking about the extent to which a hill in Uppsala made me become an historian by profession. Because I was just finished my first year of doing history. I had been offered to go to Germany as an Erasmus student. I didn't want to go to Germany. I didn't want to own up not wanting to go to Germany because I didn't want the person to know that I didn't like learning German. I'd spent a half year in Vienna already as an au pair. I was fairly proficient, but I wanted to go to an English-speaking country. And in the morning, and so I just couldn't. That was not a good enough reason to say no, right? So I delayed making the decision, thinking I'll come up with a better explanation for not going. Right, in the morning, walking up this hill, I met the guy who I needed to give the yes or no to. It was early in the morning, I was a bit out of breath, I just had my first cigarette of the morning, I was a bit dizzy. He came around the corner, caught me out and said, "Oh, hey Hanna, what are you doing? Are you going to Germany?" And because I didn't have a good explanation, I said, yes, I'm going. And I just, I really regretted it. And I ended up going to Germany, ended up gaining lots of ECTS points that I needed to transfer into the second year of doing history, ended up also into PhD program, a master program. So I had all these sort of points or credits that I needed. So I ended up doing a PhD in order to catch up with these points. And it's all because that early morning first cigarette, walking up the hill, being indecisive and being embarrassed that I didn't have a good enough. You know, is that me not having agency? I don't know.
Kismet.
Sorry?
Kismet. Fate.
I call that agency, what you did, because you made a decision, although you made it against your maybe better knowledge or whatever. I mean, I call that agency.
I mean, for me, it's funny when you raise the question about kind of referring to things that happens in one's own life, which kind of makes one think. For me, it was also Uppsala, but it was because I've been coming and going to Uppsala for a long time because I was part of the publication committee of the Nordic African Institute. So I would come from Stockholm with the train, I would get off the train at the central railway station, and I would walk from the central railway station along Kungsgatan, where the African Institute was located. But then they changed, they built up the new platforms, and you had a tunnel, which totally changed the way of how people were walking from and to the railway station. Because in the old days, you would walk to the central railway station, and the city would open up in a certain way. Now you start about 50 meters, 100 meters more to the south, going first in a tunnel and then up, and it's a total different way of how you then start to walk. Which for me was illuminating. This must be one of the first times when I really start to think about space and place. And what happens if something changes? I'm still walking to the Nordic African Institute, but it was a total different kind of way of coming into the city.
But you could have walked to another institute and your career might have been different.
No, this was kind of more of thinking of how do I know Uppsala? Because I started Uppsala in 1987 as having a scholarship at the Nordic African Institute. And since then I kind of been working a certain way, similar, same old way, and the kind of the city opened in a certain way. And then suddenly, and I realized this is a total different city opening, which also was very interesting. The same houses and so on, and then we really can start to kind of do analytical thinking.
Well, I just want to put forward that Schlögel does mean that there is bodies, there is agencies. On page 226 he writes, "There's no abstraction without the body behind it." And I think when he wrote this in 2003, this was the new thing. That, how should I say, that whenever there was much discussion that space has disappeared because of the new technology. So I do think it takes into consideration the agency. And I don't know, what's the difference between space and place? For me, for him, place is the body, I suppose. So I do think he also makes the distinction, even if he doesn't write it out.
That's a good point.
But it's embodied in different ways. And if you want to find where the power is, you have to find the place, you have to find the body. And the space is something independent of power. Could maybe one say that? I don't know. But that's how I read Schlögel. Capitalism doesn't embody power. You have to find the body. You have to find the place where the power is. It's just an abstract term, and that's what also he says here. That he talks about different concepts.
What I want to say is a bit on the same note. It's still about places of capitalism, and also because when we talk about contested spaces, and Sarajevo and squares and so on, we are talking about well-known places where the power is somehow easy to find. Where does the power come from? We have these different parties, and in a way, those are the spaces that political historians are very easily gravitated into. When we think about economic history, it's different because yes, we have the spaces, we have the banks and the stock exchanges and so on, but inspired by the chapter on hot and cold places, and this is not really what Schlögel calls a cold place, but I began thinking about the cold places of capitalism, namely firstly the datacentraler, which are, for instance, planned in Hangö and in many places.
Sulila.
Huh?
Sulila.
Yeah. What are they called in English? Anyway, I mean the datacentraler, where which need cool places because of all this energy and all this information hubbing, and we don't really see them. They are in a way non-places, but they need cooling down. And then we have all these kylrum, which are scattered all over the world. We don't see them, but they are ice cold, and lots of frozen commodities are in these rooms, and people are working there. When we talk about the agency in capitalism, then of course we have to go and look at who is owning. It becomes really faceless. Who owns these datacentraler and all these cold storage places? And when we find the body and we find the agent, it's a very long trail. I think it would probably take weeks to try and analyze where the agency actually is. But still, we have these places that are cold and that are probably horrible to work in, where thousands and thousands of people work every day and get colds and have to go to doctors' offices, which is another place. Sorry, now I'll stop.
I definitely also think that there is a connection between the body and places. The body is our vehicle that we use to move in spaces and places. But it's also that our minds are also a place where we create these abstract conceptions of different places, and they get meaning. And we don't really need to visit a place to have an abstract image of this place, that we create meaning to it. And I think it's probably something of a human condition that or something that humans do, that they organize information and knowledge as abstractions in their minds, so that there is usually an image that pops up when we're thinking of something, and usually that has a context in a place. That how we think that we use our senses also to create this, and the body, like, it's a vehicle that has senses and creates also these memories and sorts memories and sorts these conceptions into a image in their head. But usually there was a experiment done with people only listening to sounds from a city, or they didn't know what they would be listening to before they put on the headset, but in the headset they could hear sounds from a city, and then they were asked that if you had to guess, where would you say that this is, and they all answered Paris in France, because there was something that connected them to this abstract. They had never been there, but they could connect. There was something that would, a fingerprint of this city in a way that, and I think that everybody in that experiment said that probably France, probably Paris. And I think that goes for many different places also, that people have this image. Then is, of course, what I think that Schlögel is saying is that these images are, in a way, how historians also come with this knowledge of something. And then you have to contest this by going there, looking around, seeing this, contesting your own images of these places. And then the body becomes this placemaker. I think that the agency is really important here when talking about place, that there is somebody making this, explaining it, or making sense of it, or in a way like trying to grasp something. And then it's and then you can have in the same geographical point you can have several layers of places, depending on who visits, what questions are to be answered, and yeah, I think there Schlögel comes in.
Yes, again an example of same space, different place. I read a long time ago 2 memoirs from Falun. One was called Siv on Älvsborg. She was a working class girl. And the other was from Axel Österberg. He was a bourgeois boy and later became a newspaper man. And they write about the same time, and they both write about their childhood in Falun. And if you should plot out, which I could ask a student to do, the places they mention in Falun where they played, did things, went to school and so on, and what they did on those places, you would find 2 different cities, totally different. And these are some children, and you can, so sort of this same space, different place starts with the upbringing. You're formed into thinking of Falun, for example, as this is a city like this, and for another child, it's a totally different city. And for us, we are historians. I often think it's fascinating when you go down the Svärdshögatan here and see that the Vasagata is next to Daljunkersgatan. And for me, that's the 2 enemies of history, and those who made the names, they didn't care. They wrote another history with these place names. And that's, in older times, place names, streets names are very interesting to examine. Today, there's flowers and shit. That's what I want to say. Because these memoirs, they are you just have to choose carefully, because this is a type of source material that is easily available for us.
I mean, cities are in that sense, and towns are, or urban spaces are usually taken as a starting point when you do this kind of exercises. Rural landscapes are much more kind of, they are regarded to be much more kind of the long delay is much more visible on the rural side in comparison with the city. The city is fast, the countryside is slow. Let's put it this way. But that wasn't the point that I'm going to make. No, it's approaching a city is always interesting, kind of, because you come in from the suburbs usually, and then you enter the city center and so on, and you see how the different time zones are adding up. New spot out in the outskirts, and then somewhere in the city center you end up, depending on where you are, a couple of 100 years back. But then, of course, you have cities where this is not the case, where you have the impact of the Second World War erases the center, like in Dresden. So when you drive in, you have all these late 19th century bourgeois housing and so on. And when you reach the center, you're supposed to reach the center. It's a total rebuilt Plattenbauten from the GDR time, which does not follow at all the old outline of the city, because Dresden was totally wiped out. And similar we have in many of the German cities. And of course, also here in the Nordic countries, but that's not due to the war, but that's due to the post-war period when you had enough money to change the space totally. Or you wanted to manifest, let's say, the welfare state, which is very interesting for example, in Sandviken, where you have Erskine kind of building the idea of what the welfare state was supposed to be. But you want to contest me? Good?
No, not really. But again, as in the example about Sarajevo, I think it's very easy to move in the area of how should I say, the center, the story of the center. Every city has a margin. There is no such affluent city with all these buildings without the outskirts, without the storage houses, with the frozen goods and all. And somehow I think that story is more important to tell, because we know, even if we don't know every story, we know very much about the central urban history and the symbolism in the cities and the place names and the squares. We know so much less about the outskirts of the city, where these places of capitalism that are invisible, like the cold storage rooms and whatever. And they are spaces, they are places that a historian could also visit, and some of them are famous. For instance, the ones in Argentina in the early 20th century, because they have become part of the history books. So I'm not really contesting you. I'm just trying to move from the center to the margins. That's all. Because Schlögel also occupies himself very much with the center.
Let's make an exercise. How would we read London Docklands?
Gentrification.
Yeah, but before that, it's of course the heart of the empire in terms of capitalism, because all the docks and so on. But of course, with that collapsing as well, it's a totally different, which of course became a role model of how other cities now have been changing the harbor areas. Yeah. I see it in Stockholm, I see it in Copenhagen, I see it in Helsinki, I see it in Turku, where the harbors and the wharves and the docks are disappearing. Or no, they are
somewhere else. There's another place.
Of course, for Stockholm you have to go to Nynäshamn. Yeah. In Helsinki they built a new harbor. In Nordsjö and so on.
Yes, and I live at the less successful places, like I think about Hudiksvall, for instance, they have dreams about it. So you have the Morgan,
the future.
And much discussion. How could we make it? But there's no money. But that's the dream come true. But how would you say that? Where is the state of research when it comes to the history of space today? Does anyone know?
Well, when I'm discussing with geographers, they would say that now it's they have moved beyond. It would be borders and other stuff that they really kind of use. But as with so many of the turns, which is problematic, but do we want to have it a turn or do we want to have it as a kind of perspective? The question is what is going on at the moment is interesting, but I still think because I was in Copenhagen 2 weeks ago and was one of the younger generation of PhD holders who was saying that I was brought up with space. I don't really know what to do with it anymore.
Like these guys. Yeah.
So in a sense, so there's one generation who has been fed up with space and want to do something else. But I still think that space is highly interesting.
Well, I could just give my 2 cents to this. I think what was really interesting, because week 1 of studying, it was you saying that space. So space has been there always during my studies. But what I found very interesting with Schlögel is how many different sources you have for it. It's not just going somewhere and looking at a square or something. That's brilliant, and that's I think what everyone does kind of instinctively also. but to have then his phone directory things and phone catalogs and everything, there are so many different ways. And what you, Peter, said about street names, you can look at the map and see many things. Then of course you can also look at the map and then have this preconception of what the thing is like, and then you go and actually look at the thing, and it's vastly different. So it's also interesting how written sources can lie in a way with when it comes to space. But that was my sort of, if there was an eye opener, then that was it. How many different source materials there can be.
Many things in Schlögel feels very familiar, and I think it's because in Sweden there has been, in the last 10-20 years, a lot of research about monuments. And for me, the first I read was 15 years ago, a dissertation from KTH about the monuments of the French Revolution. And these monuments were specifically designed to make new spaces and new places and memories in the revolution. So this material was very good at showing what a place could mean in forming people's actions and thoughts. And we have a lot of people studying the statue risings, and Lars and I, we are very interested in these monuments from the late 19th century. And there's also the interesting thing, how you see them today, if you look for them. I'm interested in the Vasa monuments around Dalarna here. And when I want to look at them and see the papers of when they rose them, I have to go to the war archive, Krigsarkivet, because they are seen as war monuments. And I think that's interesting. There was no war when Vasa skated around Dalarna, So there's this different view about it. And on a humoristic view in the end here, I read today that someone had made a proposition, jokingly, that there should be a equestrian statue of Carl Bildt. And that sounds absurd, but if you know the man, if you know anything, that's not totally idiotic.
Equestrian.
Ryttarstaty. I think if you know the man, his character, it's quite right.
I totally agree with what Kaisa said. That for me also it was. The reading Schlögel was the eye opener was that there are so many different spaces that you can read, because I think that in earlier research or earlier spatial discussions there have maybe become kind of some general ways of looking at space that then Schlögel opens up this, and this is maybe outside the text that we were meant to read for this, but it's on 308, the page 308, where of course when talking about space and control and controlling space becomes a important issue, but this was a genius, like unintended similarity between the control of mapping spaces and the control of getting fingerprints, and how these maps are so similar. And he writes on page 309, the body and the place are the final and indispensable readouts of identity. Power and control are always and essentially power and control over bodies, which I thought was that was a really illuminating and interesting thought.
I had at one point a map of Berlin, but that map was produced in the GDR. So it was a map of Berlin, Hauptstadt der DDR. It didn't include the western side of Berlin. It was white. It was highly interesting to have a map, but only showing half of the city. And the same thing is, of course, going back to Schlögel's example of the Berlin Wall, is that the wall itself, if you look at it from above, it's the line. built up wall. But depending on from which side we approach it, it has two different images. If you approach it from the GDR side, you would have trenches and sand, and it was a controlled area. If you approach it from the western side, you would have graffiti. And you could touch the wall. But you could never touch the wall from the eastern side. Okay, got the message. We cut here. Thanks all.